Welcome to episode 10 of the Maveric Banking Edge Podcast series. Today we have PJ D.I. Gemarino, CEO, JWG, and Deepak Batter, independent consultant, risk management and regulatory compliance, hosted by P. Venkatesh, Director, Thought Leadership at Maverick Systems.
Welcome to the next edition of the Banking Edge podcast on regulatory. And I have with me PJ, a well-known name who has been a C-suite leader with street banks in the UK and subsequently for the last 2.5 decades been running a regulatory consultancy, consulting with financial institutions across the globe. He is also the most sought after person by the regulators themselves for consultation. Welcome on board, PJ.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And I also have alongside him Deepak, who has been in risk consulting for large financial institutions, and over the last 2.5 years have been doing consulting on his own, working with service providers as well as large financial institutions. He is also a passionate researcher on the risk domain and has been a contributor to this report. Welcome on board, Deepak.
Thanks, PV. Thanks here, and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. Now, PJ, this year's report has a long title and it mentions 3 components. One with regard to that ESG. How do we harness? Second, it is with regard to giving a very practical RegTech strategy for the CTOs and the CFOs. And the third is to say that how it can move from regulatory to market edge in 2025. Is the purpose to say that here is an opportunity for banks to actually combine regulatory as well as market edge by having an appropriate strategy to integrate as well as consolidate on the ESG data?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. This report really brings to life a whole bunch of different factors that are in the frame now in 2025. You know, the first is that we're really at a regulatory crunch point where the buy side and the corporates and the sell side all need to be working together around these new standards. So the CSRD is here in Europe, but there's the ISSB and all of, that's all rolling out across the globe. That's spelled out in great detail in the report. But we also have a lot of political events that are changing the way that people need to look at these requirements. And the second component is not just really the regulators, it's also the clients, right? So it's not just a compliance requirement, it's a strategic asset for dealing with your customers. And that really means that it's not optional anymore not to have the RegTech in place to be able to help manage this equation, because you're going to need the capability to scale and pivot all of your ESG information to whoever it is globally that needs to understand what it means.
Essentially, are you suggesting that there is a shift which the asset managers need to recognize, and that is here and now?
Yeah, I mean, ESG is always shifting, right? Our definition of ESG changes from year to year, whether we focus on energy or we focus on defense, and these fluctuating views often make it challenging to have a consistent definition of what exactly good ESG information looks like. But the critical thing now is we're at a fragmentation point for the way regulators want to look at it, right? So we may have different standards in California than we'll have in Delaware, and those will be different from the UK as well as what's happening in Europe. And ultimately what the crunch point now comes down to the CFO really being on the hook, right? So there's a single version of the truth that the company needs to maintain about how it answered all these questions. And as with anything in the regulatory space, it comes down to prove it. Show me how you made those calculations, and show me that what you had in the front office and what came into the middle office and what was declared in all your regulatory reports all lines up and makes sense.
Now, turning to you, Deepak, PJ mentions not only there is a shift, he also says that the levels of scrutiny on ESG data is such it has shifted from the risk or regulatory function to CFO to handhold and do. Now, in this case, how do asset managers implement these changes and be on top of things?
Sure, PV. PV, before I jump on to the, challenges, I think, I'll break it down into, what is driving this shift, right, primarily, and then as a consequence of these, what are the challenges, right, and how do we manage the shift, right? So I think very clearly, as PJ also highlighted, investor expectations are outpacing the regulatory demands, across regions, both in terms of the breadth of information and the depth of information, and they are looking at more granular, more real-time ESG data, and I think. Given this, I think even the scale of ESG funds, right, they have completely changed the game, right? It's not a mere niche, nice to have category any longer. It's rather a must have, right, and maybe a core part of the the whole industry here, right? So given these drivers, I think asset managers are having two major challenges, right? I think the primary one, which I think all of us agree and very apparent, is the fundamental data challenge itself, right? I think till date, I think ESG data which is required remains very fragmented, very inconsistent, and very difficult to verify across the various markets, right? And now with all the regulatory alignment that also is happening, but there is the absence of what I would say the universal standards and methodologies which complicate this whole alignment, right? So that is one, right? And then once we have the data, I think implementation, right? I think integration of the whole ESG data into the core processes that asset managers are having is also a challenge, right? I think either driven by market demand or even the regulatory demand, right, where certain regions today demand ESG data implementation into your core risk assessments, apart from the disclosures, and then there are certain regions which also demand assurance, right, on that, right? So ESG is no longer only about reporting, right? It has to be fully embedded into your different AM processes, right? Be it investment decisions, risk frameworks, or the whole portfolio management balancing, right? So those clearly are the two big challenges, right? And I think given these challenges, what AMs today need to do, I think they have to be very strategic, right? A lot of decisions, choices need to be made in terms of, let's say, what type of data architecture they are using, right? What is the operating model, and we also had PJ highlighting about the a CFO leading this, right? I think that is very critical, right? You need a CFO-led governance model, very strong, very transparent policies, right? I think that's the first a big picture view that I think we need to take, and the CFO has a very large role to play here, right? And I think asset management traditionally has been less regulatory heavy, right? It's but now I think the shift is there where there is going to be scrutiny not only from regulators but even from investors. So I think that needs to be the first thing. And secondly, once you get this basic structure in place, I think AMs need to very clearly know what sort of a ESG metrics they need to give to investors. What is the requirement, right? Then work backwards to understand, okay, to give this, what are the type of data do I need to have, right? What are the processes I need to be able to provide credibility to the data itself, and then sort of integrate them into the processes which we spoke about. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what AMs need to do at a very high level.
Understand, Deepak. See, PJ, Deepak is mentioning a few things here. One, it says ESG is no longer regulatory. It is also something investors are demanding. And the investors are demanding right from strategies to portfolio level granular information. And they also want it real time. unlike in the case of reports which are periodic. Is this a temporary phenomenon or here to stay? And why do you see this investor regulatory gap widening or narrowing over time, PJ?
Well, I think the key part of that question is over time, right? We have to recognize this is a medium to longer term view, as Deepak describes. Everybody would love to take the IT budget that they have and use it all to change everything and to make it better. The unfortunate reality is you have a shop to run. You have to
Correct.
you have to fly the plane across the ocean and change out one of the engines as you go. And that really makes the kind of challenge we're talking about here more of a marathon than any kind of sprint. But ultimately, it's got couple different speeds, and you need to think about the way you're going through it. So the regulators are going to be focused on the lineage and the provenance of the information that you're putting out to them on their reports. And they have common formats, but very different interpretations sometimes of what goes on those reports. So those need to be managed carefully. And in parallel, you need to look at then what the investors want and the way they're looking at the need to consume a lot of this data electronically and tie it back. And so you're going to have to reconcile those two different views. And like with any race, you just have to set clear goals for how you're going to manage that. You have to maintain the discipline across your many pieces of the organization. It's very much a team race, where you're going to have to your front office, your middle office, and your back office all lined up on what does good look like, and what are we trying to get to in this stage of the race. And for that, you really just need, as I think Deepak highlighted, a senior perspective. You need the leadership team, the CFO, the CAO, ops, data, tech, all really on the same page.
And essentially, you are saying, PJ, the gulf between the investors and the regulatory expectations are here to stay. Remind, and therefore organizations have come to terms with that and deal with that appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I don't see it going away anytime soon. So it's just the sooner you realize that you've got this gulf and information gap, the closer you'll get to closing it.
Closing. Thank you. See, Deepak, now because PJ is saying that the gulf between the investors and regulators are here to stay. Given that the investor-related requirements might be a new challenge to the asset managers, what would be your tips for them to actually go through this?
How to meet these challenges, I think, very clearly, apart from the ones which we already spoke about, I think, today asset managers having a very, the way of meeting the requirements is very decentralized, compliance led, right? Which needs to evolve, right? I think there has to be a centralized ESG strategy, policy and governance, which need to be driven at the CFO level. Right. And I think, coming back to, one of the other trends we are seeing is, the whole ESG data integration into the financial reporting itself today. Right. And so to that level, I think, a CFO led governance is very critical to maintain the same, rigor and data discipline. Right. So while we have this, I think, still at a ground level, the various business units, it could be specific to the company, what type of business units or what type of regional or geographical units, they need to, remain accountable and responsible for the data collection, validation and stuff, which then needs to feed into the, a centralized sort of ESG data structure. And then, the second bit is once that structure is set, the whole data discipline, internal controls, validation processes, I think, all those become, very critical to meet these challenges.
Understood, Deepak. See, PJ, I see Deepak outlining that there is a greater rigor for data quality which is needed now on two counts. One, ESG data is part of the financial reporting. That means it should have as much accuracy as the financial data that is reported. Second, regulators are also tightening up the regime in terms of disclosure as well as in terms of penalties for wrongful disclosure, and therefore it is from both counts it is important for data quality. What is your view, PJ, and what is your recommendation?
Yeah, look, I think it's spot on. I mean, the reg risk just got real for the board in Europe and in the UK. Regulators have been very clear in signaling like the number one priority they're coming around to talk to you about from 25 to 27 is your ability to manage your data, your operational resilience, and your IT risk. Yeah, and what they've done in Europe in particular is interesting. They've introduced the new capital buffer assessment programs, right? So this is why it's really become a board level discussion again. Yet you can always say there's some accountability regime and people might go to jail for bad data, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that. But I would put stock in, we'll add another 200 bips to your capital buffer. That's a real difficult conversation to have, especially when you're then turning around to investors and you're telling them, I can't give you the actual data you're looking for. So I think the demands from the investors and from the regulators are of real consequence, and that's what's letting people think about, or leading people to think about, how are they going to get on this path to really baking RegTech in to the way they do business. And so ultimately you don't have all these reconciliations and disconnects, and you are able to push a button and get the data across in the format that's needed with the right kind of validation rules. And our recommendation is try to get to standardized validation rules as quickly as possible. And ultimately we've seen that with things like derivatives regulatory reporting, which we helped get into the financial open source space with a common domain model, so you're able to then know that where you fit versus the herd. And I think ultimately that's the same kind of place that we're going to need to go with all this ESG reporting.
And are you indicating that, PJ, some kind of a common data model for ESG, which sorts out non-standardized or plural standardized data to be integrated, will emerge in some form or the other sooner or later?
Yeah, I mean, with the new XBRL templates around the data, that there's a lot more information to be able to help assess what good looks like. Kind of like with the financial reporting today, it all gets buried in the footnotes, right? And I think one of the challenges around ESG data is how do you get it out of the footnotes and into a common model, right? And is it possible to model all the data for ESG? Certainly not. But for the reports that the regulators defines exactly what they're looking for, it absolutely is. And I would hope that over time the investor reports take a similar direction.
Thank you, PJ. See, Deepak, you outlined in the previous ones in terms of the challenges as well as how they could gather the data and how they could actually go to implement by having the right operating model and structures to do that. Similarly, what would be your suggestion on the data quality part, given its importance both from an investor as well as from a regulator standpoint of view?
Yeah, so I think we spoke multiple times about data, and data quality is the core fundamental challenge, right? And I think for ESG specifically, I think we need to remember with these new regulations where the larger supply chain is also involved now and everything. For ESG, we get data, primarily from two sources, right? One is all the external sources, right? Your ESG data vendors. It could be, portfolio companies that asset managers are focusing on. Plus, I think, now you have internal business units also which need to, collate all this data, right? So I think, these need to be harmonized firstly, which we spoke about. But I think apart from that, depending on the firm, the asset manager governance structure and the sort of data requirements that they have, right? They need to set in place very firm specific policies, guidelines on how they would work with the data and reporting standards that they need to meet, right? So aligning this, it's internal and external sources on one side, to the internal firm specific policies and standards, it's going to be a challenge. It's easier said than done, but I think we are talking about a very diverse or dispersed, ESG data ecosystem here, right? So, that's the first thing, right? But even once you do it, we spoke about, implementing this whole across the, asset management processes, right? How do you ensure the end-to-end data integrity throughout the life cycle? The bona fide nature of data, that it should be the way it's supposed to be. Right. I think retaining that accuracy and authenticity through the life cycle is another challenge, right? I mean, not only the validation or reporting, the whole life cycle of it, right? We need to remember that any sort of discrepancies, through the life cycle here can lead to, apart from the inaccuracies in the reporting itself, right? It can actually lead to misleading insights, right? Which then invites, regulatory attention today, right? So I think that's a challenge, right? Now, help is there, right? I mean, and a lot of asset managers are looking at how to meet these challenges, right? There are what we call a portfolio of, RegTech tools available today, right? Be it for your, data integration with, benchmarking tools, or be it, for data validation, a lot of use of AI, there for audit and assurance, ESG has its own audit and assurance requirements, right? So there are multiple tools which are available, and firms are already deploying that, right? However, I think what we need to be very mindful, and what asset managers need to clearly keep in mind, is that they should not be tool led. Today I have a problem, I have a tool available, I should not just use it like that. They need to be they should not be tool led, rather they should be strategy led, understanding the overarching strategy. And that's where what we spoke about earlier becomes so much critical, right, in terms of the governance and the sort of unified data strategy that they have, right? And I think we spoke about the role of CFO. Here is where I think the role of a CTO comes into play, right? The optimum use of these tools, right? Because I think around these tools, the firm need to build their own internal tech capabilities, right? Many of these would be external tools, right? They need to be integrated within, they need to speak to each other, they need to follow the same data life cycle, right? And that integration is very crucial, right? It's going to be governed by the overarching governance, ESG data governance, which needs to be there, and that's a core function. You cannot outsource that function, right? It has to be done in-house, right? So, the strategic choice of RegTech tools as a portfolio, and then to build the tech capabilities around those tools, so that implementation into the processes is more nuanced and more methodological, is sort of very critical, PV.
Understand, Deepak. Essentially, you are saying that given its importance and also the availability of tools, people have to only make sure that
Right.
how they are going to execute the data quality, and what are the stages that they need to pass through, and
Right.
choose an appropriate tool that will meet their purpose, into making sure that right from the data gathering to the final reporting, at every stage there is validation, and there are
Yes.
tools available to do that. Is that what I hear from you, Deepak?
Yes. Yes.
Now, PJ, though ESG originated as a regulatory requirement, now it seems to be taken over by the investors' demands. Now, how do you see ESG being part of the asset management firm's portfolio?
Well, I think it's integral to the whole company balance sheet and report and view of risk, right? So ultimately, at the end of this marathon, putting ourselves, a couple decades in the future, we'll look back and laugh about how difficult it was to integrate all this data. Fortunately, we have technologies running ahead that help us integrate all this, right? I mean, this is where, the ability to have the semantic models and the graph databases and everything to help with the large language model integration and process all this text really, really help bring this together in a common framework. But I think ultimately, it is one picture. It is one supply chain. People just have many different views, right? And so the asset manager has that company in their portfolio needs to understand how to disclose what that company does. The company needs to be able to disclose that to the investors. The investors then need to be able to pass that to the sell side. I mean, there's a whole chain of custody around this data, and I think ultimately what we're moving to is exchanging information like we do today in the financial system with payments. We're doing that now with ESG information and as we have done for a long time with company information. So it's going to take us a while to get there, but the tools are here now, and we can take any sources of divergence and start moving them to a common view of the truth. So that's really where my hope is, that we can take the common versions of the truth across the different actors, and we can begin to align them with standards.
And do I hear, Vijay, that the asset management firms have been entrusted or put the burden on for actually ensuring quality ESG data for the larger consumption?
Absolutely. That's what it's all about. It's taking those individual corporates and rolling them up to portfolios, and portfolios up to legal entities, and so on and so on. So it's taking it's translating the overall direction from the investment that's coming into the company into action, and being able to then prove that the actions they took were aligned with the mandates.
Thank you, PJ. So if I heard both of you right, it looks like ESG is no longer a regulatory agenda. It is largely driven by the investors. And because it is being driven by the investors, it has become central or critical or core to the investment asset management firms themselves for their business, both to attract the right portfolios as well as to attract the right quality of investors. And ESG portfolios have been growing, and therefore, if they were to be part of that, they better clear out their strategies as well as the instruments for gathering and reporting on ESG data in order to be on the forefront of that. And therefore, in short, it also gives an opportunity to turn a regulatory mandate into a business opportunity mandate if it is correctly executed. Do both of you agree?
Yes, PV. Yes, I think spot on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of judging what good looks like, you have different race officials along the marathon, and I think as you point out, the good will look different to all of them, and it's up to you and your firm at the end of the day to make a call as to what's good enough for you.
Yeah.
And the answer this year won't be the same as 5 years from now, but
exactly.
You ought to think about how to get there.
How much ESG in their portfolio is vital and critical for their growth is going to determine how they are going to view them and make them good. That's what you are saying, Vijay. Yes, well and good.
Agreed.
Thank you so much for both of you being there. It's been a wonderful and experience to go through with both of you on this edition of the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.